began to read more carefully, going through entry after entry of documented incidents. As he read, his expression grew darker and more troubled. They were interrupted by Sarah's voice calling from the kitchen. "Mark, could you come help me with something?" Dad looked up from the notebook, then back at Emma. "Stay here," he said. "We're not done talking." Emma nodded, watching as her father walked toward the kitchen with her notebook still in his hands. She could hear Sarah's cheerful voice greeting him, but she couldn't make out the words of their conversation. Emma sat alone in the living room, her heart pounding, knowing that her entire future was being decided in the next room. Either Dad would believe her and finally see Sarah for who she really was, or this would be the final piece of evidence that Emma was troubled and needed to be sent away. Outside, it had started to snow. Danny Martinez stepped off his motorcycle with the arrogance of someone who believed intimidation was his birthright. His heavy boots hit the pavement with deliberate force as he approached Frank, who was still bent over retrieving his dropped keys. The other 5 bikers remained on their motorcycles, engines running, creating a wall of noise and menace that seemed to fill the entire parking lot with tension. Frank straightened up slowly, his Korean War veteran cap clearly visible as he turned to face Danny. The elderly man's eyes showed no fear, only the quiet dignity of someone who had faced far worse situations during his 3 years of military service in Korea. He had survived brutal winters, enemy attacks, and the loss of close friends in combat. A confrontation with an angry biker was not going to break his spirit or his resolve. Danny's bloodshot eyes immediately focused on Frank's veteran cap, and instead of showing the respect that most Americans would display, his expression twisted into one of contempt and mockery. To Danny, the cap represented everything he rebelled against: authority, military discipline, and the values of an older generation that he felt had failed him. His drug and alcohol-clouded judgment made him see Frank not as a war hero deserving respect, but as a symbol of a system he despised. Inside the diner, Betty pressed her face against the window, her heart racing as she watched the confrontation developing in the parking lot. Other customers began gathering at the windows, some reaching for their cell phones to call for help. Rose, the diner owner, was already dialing 911, her voice trembling as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher and described the threatening situation unfolding outside her restaurant. Danny moved closer to Frank, deliberately invading the elderly veteran's personal space in an obvious attempt to intimidate him. His voice was loud and aggressive as he began hurling insults, questioning Frank's right to wear the veteran cap and making crude comments about his age and physical condition. The verbal assault was designed to humiliate Frank in front of the growing number of witnesses watching from inside the diner. Frank remained calm and composed, his military training evident in his ability to maintain his dignity under pressure. He attempted to defuse the dangerous situation by speaking in a steady, respectful tone, explaining that he simply wanted to get in his truck and drive home. His peaceful response only seemed to anger Danny further, who interpreted Frank's calmness as weakness and his politeness as an invitation to escalate the confrontation. The situation reached a dangerous turning point when Danny suddenly shoved Frank backwards with both hands. The elderly veteran stumbled, his cane falling from his grip as he struggled to maintain his balance against the side of his truck. The sight of the 81-year-old war hero being physically attacked by a man less than half his age sent shockwaves of horror and outrage through the witnesses inside the diner. Frank managed to steady himself against his truck, but Danny was far from finished with his assault. Emboldened by his companion's laughter and crude encouragement, he grabbed Frank's veteran cap from his head and threw it to the ground, then stepped on it with his heavy boot. The deliberate disrespect shown to the symbol of Frank's military service was like a physical blow to every veteran and patriotic citizen watching the scene unfold. What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Danny, feeling powerful and completely in control of the situation, decided to take his aggression to the next level. With Frank defenseless and struggling to maintain his dignity, Danny threw a vicious punch that connected with the side of the elderly man's face. The sound of the impact was audible even through the diner's windows. Frank crumpled to the asphalt, his head striking the pavement with a sickening sound that made several witnesses inside the diner cry out in horror. The Korean War veteran, who had survived enemy fire and harsh battlefield conditions in service to his country, lay motionless on the parking lot of a small-town diner, the victim of a senseless and cowardly act of violence. The witnesses inside the diner erupted in gasps, screams and cries of shock and disbelief. Several people rushed outside to help Frank, while others continued calling for emergency services. Betty was among the first to reach the fallen veteran, kneeling beside him and checking for signs of consciousness, while fighting back tears of anger and heartbreak at what she had witnessed. Danny stood over Frank's unconscious form, his chest heaving with adrenaline and misplaced pride in his brutal actions. His fellow bikers cheered and revved their engines, treating the assault on an elderly veteran as if it were some kind of victory worth celebrating. The scene was a stark display of cowardice and cruelty that would haunt the memories of everyone who witnessed it. As sirens began wailing in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment, Danny suddenly realized the gravity of what he had done. The drug and alcohol-fueled bravado began to fade, replaced by the sobering reality that he had just brutally assaulted an elderly man in front of dozens of witnesses. His companions, equally aware that the situation had spiraled completely out of control, began urging him to flee before law enforcement arrived. Frank lay unconscious on the pavement, his breathing shallow but steady. A small crowd had gathered around him, including several customers from the diner who were trying to provide comfort and assistance while waiting for professional medical help to arrive. Someone had placed a jacket under his head to cushion it, while another person was gently applying pressure to a cut on his forehead where he had struck the ground. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed closely by several police cars with lights flashing and sirens blaring. Paramedics immediately began assessing Frank's condition and providing emergency medical care, while police officers took detailed statements from witnesses and began searching for the bikers, who had fled the scene just moments before their arrival. The description of Danny and his motorcycle was immediately broadcast over police radios throughout the county. As Frank was carefully loaded into the ambulance, Betty held his veteran cap, now dirty and slightly damaged from being thrown to the ground and stepped on. She promised the unconscious veteran that she would keep it safe until he recovered, though she had no way of knowing whether he would survive the brutal and unprovoked attack. The diner's parking lot was quickly transformed into a crime scene, marked off with yellow tape as investigators documented evidence and interviewed the many witnesses who had seen the assault. The peaceful morning routine that Frank had enjoyed for years had been shattered by an act of senseless violence that left the entire community shaken, angry, and demanding justice for the elderly war hero. At Millbrook General Hospital, Frank Miller lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet efficiency of medical staff working around the clock. The doctors had confirmed a severe concussion, multiple facial bruises, and several cracked ribs from his fall to the pavement. His advanced age made the recovery process more complicated and uncertain, with medical professionals keeping a careful watch for any signs of brain swelling or other life-threatening complications. Detective Sarah Johnson from the county sheriff's department was assigned to investigate the assault case, and she immediately began trying to locate Frank's family members. The emergency contact information in his wallet was outdated, listing his deceased wife Eleanor as the primary contact. Frank's driver's license showed his home address, but initial attempts to find living relatives had proven challenging. The elderly veteran seemed to live a quiet, isolated life with few obvious connections to family or close friends. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, Army Lieutenant Colonel Michael Miller was in the middle of a tactical planning meeting when his aide knocked on the conference room door with an urgent message. There had been a call from the American Red Cross about his father being hospitalized after a violent assault. Michael felt his stomach drop as he listened to the limited details that were available at that moment. Michael Miller had not spoken to his father in over 3 years, the result of a bitter argument about Michael's military career and what Frank saw as his son's neglect of family responsibilities. Frank had initially supported Michael's decision to join the Army, but as the years passed and Michael chose to make the military his lifelong career, their relationship had become increasingly strained and difficult. The conflict between father and son was rooted in misunderstanding and stubborn pride on both sides. Frank believed that Michael was using his military service as an excuse to avoid settling down, getting married, and starting a family of his own. Michael, on the other hand, felt that his father didn't understand or appreciate the importance of his work or the sacrifices he was making in service to his country. Both men were too proud to make the first move toward reconciliation. As Michael made urgent arrangements to travel to his father's bedside, he couldn't stop thinking about their last conversation. It had been a heated phone call on Frank's birthday 3 years earlier, with harsh words exchanged on both sides. Frank had accused Michael of caring more about his military career than his own family, while Michael had responded that his father was selfish and didn't understand the modern military or its mission. Both men had hung up angry, and neither had been willing to swallow their pride and reach out to repair the relationship. The flight from Kentucky to Frank's home state seemed to take forever. Michael sat in his military uniform, staring out the airplane window and thinking about all the things he should have said to his father over the years. He remembered the pride in Frank's voice when Michael had graduated from West Point, and the letters his father had written during his early deployments, filled with advice, encouragement, and love. During the flight, Michael received additional details about the assault from Detective Johnson, who had finally managed to track him down through military emergency notification systems. The description of what had happened to his father filled Michael with a mixture of rage and overwhelming guilt. Rage at the coward who had attacked a defenseless elderly veteran, and guilt that he hadn't been there to protect the man who had sacrificed so much for his family and his country. What Detective Johnson didn't know, and what Michael was beginning to remember during his journey home, was the full extent of Frank Miller's distinguished military service record. Frank had been characteristically modest about his achievements in Korea, rarely speaking about the specifics of his service even to his own son. Like many veterans of his generation, Frank believed that he had simply done his duty and saw no need to boast about his wartime experiences. However, Michael knew from family stories and old military documents that his father's service had been far from ordinary. Frank had served with exceptional distinction in some of the most dangerous and important operations of the Korean War, earning multiple commendations for bravery under fire and leadership in combat situations. He had been part of an elite reconnaissance unit that operated behind enemy lines, gathering crucial intelligence that had saved countless American and Allied lives. More importantly for the current situation, Frank's military service had connected him to a vast network of fellow veterans and their families that spanned multiple generations. Many of the men he had served with had gone on to distinguished military careers of their own, and their children and grandchildren now served in various branches of the armed forces around the world. Frank Miller was not just any elderly veteran. He was part of a brotherhood that had always taken care of its own members. As Michael's plane finally landed and he made his way to the hospital, he was already formulating plans that went far beyond simply visiting his injured father. The assault on Frank Miller was not just a crime against an individual person. It was an attack on everything that Michael and his fellow service members had sworn to protect and defend. The fact that his father had been targeted while wearing his Korean War veteran cap made the attack even more personal and symbolic. Michael arrived at the hospital still wearing his military dress uniform, the silver oak leaves on his shoulders clearly marking his rank as a lieutenant colonel. The sight of the tall, imposing officer striding through the hospital corridors with obvious purpose drew attention from staff members and visitors alike. When he reached the intensive care unit and saw his father lying unconscious in the hospital bed, Michael felt a wave of emotion that he hadn't experienced since his first combat deployment in Afghanistan. Frank looked smaller and more fragile than Michael remembered, his weathered face bruised and bandaged from the vicious assault. The Korean War veteran cap that Frank had worn with such quiet pride was nowhere to be seen, having been taken as evidence by the police investigating the crime. Michael sat beside his father's hospital bed and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to cry for the complicated relationship they shared and the senseless violence that had brought them together again under such terrible circumstances. As Michael maintained his vigil beside Frank's bedside throughout the night, his military training and leadership experience began to take over. He started making phone calls to former colleagues, fellow officers, and contacts throughout the extensive military community. Word of the brutal assault began spreading through military networks with remarkable speed, carried by secure communications and personal relationships that spanned the entire armed forces structure. The stage was being set for a response that Danny, Martinez, and his fellow bikers could never have anticipated or imagined. Frank Miller's assault had awakened something powerful and determined, and the full weight of the American military community was about to focus its collective attention on bringing justice to those responsible for attacking one of their most respected and honored members. News of Frank Miller's brutal assault spread through military channels with the speed and efficiency of a coordinated military operation. Within hours of Michael's arrival at the hospital, secure communication lines were buzzing with conversations between officers stationed around the globe. The story contained all the elements that stirred the deepest protective instincts of the military community. An elderly veteran attacked by younger criminals, a Korean War hero disrespected and brutalized, and a family separated by pride and misunderstanding brought together by tragedy. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Miller's first phone call was to his commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Rodriguez, who had served alongside Michael during 2 deployments to Iraq. When she heard what had happened to Frank, her response was immediate and decisive. She granted Michael extended emergency leave and offered any resources he might need to ensure his father received the best possible medical care and support. More importantly, she began making her own calls to contacts throughout the extensive military network. The second call was to Command Sergeant Major Thomas Chen, Michael's former first sergeant, who now served as a senior instructor at the Army's leadership school. Chen had met Frank Miller on several occasions during family visits and had always been deeply impressed by the elderly veteran's quiet dignity, sharp mind, and obvious pride in his son's military achievements. When Chen learned of the assault, his reaction was swift and intensely personal. As word continued to spread exponentially through military communications networks, the response grew larger and more organized with each passing hour. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a military police officer stationed at a base 2 hours away from Millbrook, received the news through her network of contacts and immediately volunteered to assist with the investigation in any way possible. Her expertise in both military law and civilian criminal procedures would prove invaluable in ensuring that justice was served properly and completely. In a veterans' hospital 3 states away, retired Master Sergeant Robert Tank Washington received a phone call that made his blood boil with righteous anger. Tank had served alongside Frank in the same reconnaissance unit in Korea nearly 70 years earlier, and the 2 men had maintained a close friendship through letters, phone calls, and occasional visits ever since. When Tank learned that his old friend and battle companion had been attacked while wearing his veteran cap, he immediately began organizing a response that would draw from decades of military connections and friendships. The military community's reaction was not limited to active duty personnel and recent veterans. Veterans from multiple generations and conflicts began mobilizing, each bringing their own extensive networks of contacts and resources to support Frank and his family. Vietnam veterans who had learned the vital importance of sticking together during the difficult years after their unpopular war, Gulf War veterans who understood the healing power of military brotherhood, and Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who had experienced firsthand the strength that comes from military camaraderie all began contributing to a rapidly growing effort. Social media platforms used by military, families, and veterans organizations began lighting up with posts about the assault. The story was shared thousands of times within the first day, with each share accompanied by expressions of outrage and sincere offers of assistance. Military families across the country began organizing fundraising efforts to help with Frank's medical expenses, even though his military insurance and veterans benefits would cover most costs. The gesture was about showing solidarity and support, rather than addressing financial necessity. Detective Johnson found herself fielding dozens of calls from military personnel offering assistance with the investigation. While she appreciated the overwhelming support and genuine desire to help, she had to carefully balance the enthusiasm of Frank's extended military family with the legal requirements of conducting a proper criminal investigation. However, the additional resources and expertise being offered were genuinely helpful in tracking down Danny Martinez and his accomplices. At the hospital, Michael maintained his constant vigil beside his father's bed while coordinating the growing response from the military community. Frank remained unconscious, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery prospects. The elderly veteran's vital signs were stable, and the dangerous swelling in his brain was beginning to slowly reduce. Michael found himself talking to his unconscious father, sharing stories about his military career and expressing deep regrets about their estranged relationship. On the second day after the assault, Frank began showing encouraging signs of returning consciousness. His eyes fluttered open briefly, and he seemed to recognize Michael despite his obvious confusion about where he was and what had happened to him. The moment of recognition between father and son was deeply emotional for both men, though Frank was still too weak and disoriented to engage in any meaningful conversation. Michael held his father's weathered hand and promised that everything would be all right. The medical staff was amazed by the constant stream of visitors asking about Frank's condition and offering support. Military personnel in uniform, veterans from multiple eras and conflicts, and family members of service personnel all came to show their respect and solidarity. The hospital had never experienced such an outpouring of community support for a single patient. Flowers, cards, and gifts began filling Frank's room and spilling into the hallway outside. Meanwhile, Danny Martinez was discovering that his brief moment of dominance in the diner parking lot had unleashed consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined in his worst nightmares. Police had tracked him down within 18 hours of the assault, thanks to detailed witness descriptions, security camera footage from nearby businesses, and tips from community members who recognized him. He was arrested at his apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the day of the attack. Danny's initial swagger and bravado quickly evaporated when he learned about the extensive military response to his actions. His court-appointed public defender explained that assaulting a veteran, particularly one wearing military insignia, could result in enhanced charges and significantly harsher penalties. More concerning for Danny was the growing realization that his victim was not just any elderly man, but the father of a high-ranking military officer with extensive connections throughout the armed forces. The other 5 bikers who had been present during the assault were also identified and arrested within 48 hours. Their motorcycle club, which had operated with relative impunity in the area for several years, suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. The assault on Frank Miller had brought unwanted attention to all their activities, and several members began cooperating with authorities in an attempt to distance themselves from Danny's violent actions. As news of the arrests spread through the military network, there was a sense of satisfaction that justice was beginning to be served through proper legal channels. However, the story was far from over. The military community's response was evolving from immediate crisis management to long-term support for Frank and his family, and their visible presence was about to become much more apparent to the general public. Local news outlets began picking up the story, drawn by the compelling human interest angle of a war hero attacked by bikers and the subsequent overwhelming military community response. Television reporters started requesting interviews with Michael and other military personnel involved in supporting Frank's recovery. The story was rapidly becoming much bigger than just a simple assault case. On the morning of Danny Martinez's arraignment hearing, an extraordinary and unprecedented scene began unfolding outside the Millbrook County Courthouse. Military vehicles started arriving in the pre-dawn hours, not as part of any official deployment, but as individual service members and veterans making personal decisions to show their support for Frank Miller and his family. The sight of uniformed personnel gathering in solidarity was both deeply moving and impressively organized to early morning. Commuters and courthouse staff, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Miller had not directly organized this massive gathering, but he understood its profound significance and importance. Word had spread through military networks that Danny Martinez would be facing formal charges, and hundreds of service members from multiple branches of the armed forces had requested leave or adjusted their duty schedules to attend the hearing. They came from nearby military installations, from Reserve and National Guard units, and from veteran organizations throughout the entire region. Some had traveled hundreds of miles overnight to be present for this moment. Command Sergeant Major Thomas Chen had coordinated transportation for local military personnel, but even he was amazed and moved by the impressive turnout. Active duty soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans from Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The diversity of uniforms, ranks, and generations represented decades of American military service united by a common cause and shared values. The courthouse steps became an impromptu gathering place where old friendships were renewed and new connections were forged. Veterans shared stories about their own service experiences while active duty personnel listened respectfully to the wisdom and experiences of their predecessors. The atmosphere was solemn but determined, with everyone present understanding that they were participating in something much larger than themselves and their individual experiences. Local law enforcement officials initially expressed concerns about crowd control and security, but their worries quickly proved completely unfounded. The military personnel and veterans conducted themselves with the discipline, respect, and dignity expected of their training and background. They formed orderly lines, followed all instructions from courthouse security personnel, and maintained the dignified bearing that reflected well on their service and their commitment to justice. No one raised their voice inappropriately, no one caused disturbances, and everyone showed proper respect for the legal proceedings. Inside the hospital, Frank Miller was now fully conscious and aware of what had happened to him during the assault. The doctors had moved him out of intensive care into a regular room, and his recovery was progressing better than anyone had dared to hope. When Michael told his father about the overwhelming support from the military community, Frank was overcome with emotion and deeply moved by the response. He had spent recent years believing that his service in Korea had been largely forgotten by younger generations, but the massive outpouring of solidarity proved that military brotherhood truly transcended time and generational differences. Frank insisted on watching the arraignment proceedings on the hospital room television, despite his doctor's concerns about the stress and excitement it might cause to his still recovering system. Michael sat beside his father's bed, both men silent and emotional as they watched live news coverage of the hundreds of uniformed personnel gathered outside the courthouse. For Frank, seeing so many young service members honoring his sacrifice and showing respect for his service was more healing than any medication or medical treatment could provide. The arraignment itself was a brief and routine legal proceeding, but its impact was dramatically amplified by the massive military presence outside the courthouse. Danny Martinez, escorted into the courthouse in handcuffs and wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, could clearly see the uniformed crowd through the windows. His former swagger and arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by the haunted look of someone who finally understood the true magnitude and consequences of his actions. Danny's attorney, a public defender named Robert Stevens who had handled hundreds of assault cases, had never dealt with a case that attracted such high-profile military attention and community interest. He explained to his increasingly nervous client that the assault charges were serious enough on their own merits, but the victim's status as a distinguished Korean War veteran and the extensive community support would likely influence both the prosecution's approach and the judge's eventual sentencing decisions. Danny was looking at significant prison time if convicted on all charges. As Danny stood before Judge Patricia Martinez for his formal arraignment, the full weight of his actions became completely apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Martinez, herself a Navy veteran who had served in the Gulf War, read the charges with particular emphasis on the assault of an elderly veteran and the disrespect shown to military service. She denied bail, citing the severity of the charges, the defendant's criminal history, and the clear risk of flight. But her decision was also influenced by the obvious community outrage demonstrated by the massive military presence outside her courthouse. The 5 other bikers who had been present during the assault faced their own arraignments on charges ranging from conspiracy to failure to render aid to an injured person. Their attorneys were frantically busy negotiating plea agreements in exchange for testimony against Danny Martinez. The motorcycle club that had seemed so powerful and intimidating in the diner parking lot was rapidly falling apart under intense legal pressure and public scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Miller addressed the gathered military personnel and veterans in a brief but powerful speech. He thanked everyone for their overwhelming support and emphasized that justice would be served through proper legal channels rather than vigilante action. He spoke eloquently about his father's distinguished service in Korea and the fundamental values that military service represented: honor, duty, courage, and protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The crowd began to disperse after the arraignment concluded, but not before organizing ongoing support for Frank's continued recovery and the upcoming legal proceedings. Veterans organizations pledged to cover any expenses not handled by insurance, while active duty personnel volunteered to assist with transportation, home maintenance, and other practical needs. The military community had effectively adopted Frank Miller and his family as their own, creating a support network that would last for years to come. Local news coverage of the courthouse gathering went viral on social media platforms, with powerful images of uniformed service members standing in solidarity, being shared across the country and around the world. The story resonated strongly with Americans from all backgrounds who respected military service and were outraged by the senseless attack on an elderly veteran. Messages of support and encouragement poured in from every state in the nation. The impact on the local Millbrook community was equally significant and lasting. Residents who had previously felt intimidated by Danny Martinez's motorcycle club and similar groups saw clearly that there were serious consequences for bullying and violence. The visible support for Frank Miller sent a powerful message that veterans and their families would never stand alone when facing injustice or threats. At Rosie's Diner, the scene of the original incident, business had actually increased significantly as people came to show support for the establishment where Frank had been a beloved regular customer. The staff, particularly Betty the waitress, became local heroes for their quick response in calling for help and their ongoing support for Frank during his recovery. Rose, the owner, decided to permanently dedicate Frank's favorite booth to his memory, placing a small bronze plaque honoring his service and his status as a valued member of their diner family. 4 months after the brutal assault, Frank Miller sat in the front row of the same courthouse where hundreds of military personnel had gathered for Danny Martinez's arraignment. This time, however, Frank was present for the sentencing hearing, having recovered sufficiently to attend the proceedings that would bring final closure to his ordeal. Beside him sat his son Michael, their relationship completely transformed and strengthened by the shared experience of trauma, recovery, and reconciliation. The intervening months had been a remarkable period of healing on multiple levels that affected everyone involved. Frank's physical recovery had exceeded all medical expectations, though he still moved more slowly than before the attack and required his cane more frequently for support and stability. More importantly, the emotional healing between father and son had progressed beautifully and naturally. The crisis had forced both proud men to confront their stubborn attitudes and wounded feelings, leading to honest, heartfelt conversations about their relationship and their shared commitment to military values and family bonds. Michael had taken extended leave to care for his father during the critical initial recovery period, and their daily interactions had gradually rebuilt the trust, respect, and deep affection that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and wounded pride. Frank came to truly appreciate and understand his son's dedication to military service and the sacrifices he made for his country, while Michael gained a much deeper understanding of his father's experiences in Korea and the tremendous sacrifices made by veterans of that often forgotten war. The legal proceedings had moved forward with unusual efficiency and thoroughness, partly due to the overwhelming evidence against Danny Martinez, and partly because of the intense public attention and military community interest focused on the case. Danny's 4 accomplices had all accepted plea agreements in exchange for their complete testimony against him, leaving him isolated and facing the full weight of both the criminal justice system and public outrage. His attorney had attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution, backed by strong community support and clear evidence, had insisted on taking the case to trial. The trial itself had been a stark study in contrast between good and evil, honor and cowardice. On one side was Danny Martinez, represented by an overworked public defender and facing a mountain of evidence including witness testimony, security camera footage, and his own extensive prior criminal record. On the other side was Frank Miller, supported by a legal team that included several attorneys, who were also military veterans and who had volunteered their services, completely free of charge. The prosecution had presented a compelling and thorough case that went far beyond the simple facts of the assault itself. They painted a detailed picture of Danny Martinez as a habitual offender and community menace who had terrorized the area for years, with the brutal attack on Frank representing the culmination of a dangerous pattern of increasingly violent and antisocial behavior. Witness after witness testified about Danny's previous acts of intimidation, violence, and complete disregard for law and order. The defense had little to work with, attempting to argue that Danny's actions were the result of substance abuse and a troubled childhood. However, the jury was not moved by these excuses, particularly when faced with the overwhelming evidence of premeditated cruelty and the Heartbreaking testimony from Frank himself about the physical and emotional trauma he had endured. Frank's testimony had been the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Speaking in a clear, steady voice despite his age and injuries, he described not just the physical assault, but the deep hurt he felt at having his military service mocked and disrespected. He spoke about his pride in wearing his Korean War veteran cap and what it meant to him as a symbol of his service to his country. His dignity and grace under cross-examination had moved several jurors to tears. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges, including aggravated assault, assault on an elderly person, and hate crime enhancements. The courtroom had erupted in applause, which Judge Martinez had allowed to continue for several moments before calling for order. Danny Martinez had shown no emotion upon hearing the verdict, staring straight ahead as if in shock. Now, 4 months later, the courtroom was once again packed with military personnel and community supporters as Judge Martinez prepared to announce Danny's sentence. The victim impact statements had been powerful and moving, with Frank speaking about his recovery and his gratitude for the support he had received. Michael had also spoken, describing how the attack had initially torn his family apart, but ultimately brought them closer together than they had ever been before. Outside the courthouse, the same sense of military solidarity was evident, though the crowd was smaller and more subdued than during the arraignment. Veterans and active duty personnel had once again gathered to show their support for Frank and to witness the conclusion of this important case. Local news crews were present to cover the sentencing, and the story continued to resonate with people across the country who had followed the case through social media and news reports. Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air as Judge Martinez reviewed her notes and prepared to deliver the sentence that would determine Danny Martinez's fate. Frank gripped his son's hand tightly, both men understanding that this moment represented not just justice for the assault, but validation of the values and principles that had guided their military service and their commitment to their community and country. Judge Patricia Martinez looked directly at Danny Martinez as she prepared to deliver his sentence, her voice carrying the weight of justice and the gravity of his crimes. The courtroom was completely silent, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in a case that had touched hearts and minds across the country. Danny stood with his head down, finally showing some recognition of the severity of his actions and their consequences. The judge spoke clearly and deliberately as she outlined the reasoning behind her sentencing decision. She emphasized the particular seriousness of assaulting an elderly veteran, the premeditated nature of the attack, and Danny's complete lack of remorse during the months following his arrest. She noted that his actions had not only physically harmed Frank Miller, but had also deeply wounded the entire military community and violated the basic principles of respect and decency that held society together. When Judge Martinez announced the sentence of 15 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 8 years, the courtroom remained respectfully quiet, despite the satisfaction that many felt at hearing these words. Danny Martinez would spend the next decade and a half paying for his moment of violent cowardice, and the community could rest assured that he would not be able to harm anyone else for a very long time. Frank Miller felt a profound sense of closure as he heard the sentence pronounced. The justice system had worked exactly as it should, providing appropriate punishment for the crime, while following proper legal procedures throughout the entire process. More importantly, the outpouring of support from the military community had restored his faith in the values he had fought for in Korea and had shown him that his service was still remembered and honored by younger generations. After the sentencing hearing concluded, Frank and Michael walked slowly out of the courthouse together, surrounded by the same military personnel and veterans who had supported them throughout the entire ordeal. The crowd was jubilant but respectful, celebrating justice while maintaining the dignity that had characterized their response from the very beginning. Several news reporters requested interviews, and Frank graciously agreed to speak briefly about his experience and his gratitude for the overwhelming support he had received. Standing on the courthouse steps with his son beside him and dozens of uniformed service members behind him, Frank spoke with quiet dignity about the importance of standing up to bullies and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He emphasized that the real victory was not Danny Martinez's imprisonment, but the way the military community had come together to support one of their own in a time of need. His words were broadcast across the country and shared widely on social media platforms. The return to Rosie's Diner later that day was deeply emotional for everyone involved. Frank had not been back to the restaurant since the day of the assault, and the staff was nervous about how he would react to returning to the scene of such a traumatic experience. However, Frank was determined to reclaim this important part of his routine and to show that he would not be intimidated by the memory of what had happened in the parking lot. When Frank and Michael walked through the front door of the diner, the entire restaurant fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause and cheers. Betty, the waitress who had witnessed the assault and kept Frank's veteran cap safe during his recovery, approached with tears in her eyes and carefully placed the cap on his head. The simple gesture was profoundly moving, symbolizing not just the return of a treasured possession, but Frank's reclamation of his dignity and his place in the community. Rose, the diner owner, had prepared a special surprise for Frank's return. She unveiled the bronze plaque that had been installed at his favorite booth, dedicating it permanently to his memory and his service to the country. The plaque read simply, "Reserved for Frank Miller, Korean War veteran and American hero." The booth would serve as a lasting reminder of Frank's courage, both in war and in the face of senseless violence. The celebration at the diner was attended by many of the same military personnel who had supported Frank throughout his ordeal, creating a joyful reunion that felt like a family gathering. Veterans from different eras shared stories and experiences, while active duty personnel listened respectfully and learned from their predecessors. The bonds that had been forged during the crisis would continue long after the immediate situation had been resolved. In the weeks and months that followed Danny Martinez's sentencing, life gradually returned to a new normal for Frank Miller and his family. The relationship between Frank and Michael continued to strengthen and deepen, with regular phone calls, visits, and shared experiences replacing the years of silence and misunderstanding that had separated them. Michael arranged his military assignments to allow for more frequent trips home, and Frank began planning to visit his son at his military base. The broader impact of Frank's story extended far beyond his individual experience and recovery. The case had highlighted the ongoing challenges faced by elderly veterans and the importance of treating all senior citizens with respect and dignity. Veterans organizations across the country used Frank's story as an example of the power of military brotherhood and the importance of supporting fellow veterans in times of need. The Steel Wolves Motorcycle Club, which had terrorized the Millbrook area for years, effectively ceased to exist following Danny Martinez's conviction and the arrest of several other members on various charges. The community was finally free from their intimidation and violence, and local law enforcement credited the military community's response with helping to break up the criminal organization. Frank Miller returned to his routine of visiting Rosie's Diner twice a week, but now his meals were often shared with new friends from the military community who had become part of his extended family. His lonely days following his wife's death had been replaced by a rich network of relationships and activities that gave new meaning and purpose to his life. The story of the elderly Korean War veteran who was brutally attacked by a biker, only to see his son arrive with hundreds of soldiers at his side, became a powerful symbol of justice, redemption, and the enduring strength of military brotherhood. It served as a reminder that heroes come in all ages, that justice can prevail over violence, and that the bonds forged in military service can overcome even the most serious personal differences and challenges. Frank Miller's courage in the face of cowardly violence had inspired a nation and reunited a family, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the parking lots and courtrooms of small American towns where ordinary people stand up for what is right.